Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
But the part that had truly thrown her off, when he had shyly asked for her personal number. It had come near the end of their marathon meeting turned flirtation session. They'd been wrapping up, reluctantly acknowledging that eventually they needed to rejoin the real world, where clients and designers didn't spend entire afternoons discussing fantasy football and bourbon preferences. "I think we've covered everything professionally required," he'd said, glancing at his watch with apparent surprise at how much time had passed. "Though I feel like we've barely scratched the surface up." "Other topics?" Kristin had nodded, gathering her presentation materials with a strange reluctance. "We did manage to fit some actual business discussion in between debating quarterback statistics." Barely, he'd admitted with that devastating half-smile. "My CFO would be appalled at how little contract negotiation happened today. My assistant will be insufferable." Kristin had replied with a small laugh. "He already thinks he's my personal matchmaker." Daniel Carter, the confident, smooth, commanding businessman who had dominated the meeting with his presence, who had flirted with the precision of a master swordsman, who had made decisions about multi-million-dollar design concepts without hesitation, had actually looked a little uncertain as he made the request. He'd run a hand through his perfectly styled hair, creating an endearing dishevelment that somehow made him even more attractive. Speaking of which, he'd begun, his usual smooth baritone carrying a hint of hesitation. "I was wondering if I could get your personal number for follow-up questions." The slight pause before follow-up questions had hung in the air between them, both of them fully aware no business-related follow-up would require her personal line. "Follow-up questions," Kristin had repeated, unable to keep the amusement from her voice. "About the design proposal." Daniel had shrugged, a surprisingly boyish gesture from a man who exuded such confidence in every other moment. "Among other things, football strategies, buffalo wing recipes, the merits of bourbon versus scotch." And Kristin, she had gotten shy herself. Her, the same woman who had just spent 2 hours shamelessly flirting, who had matched him innuendo for innuendo, who had confidently invited him to her apartment for the game, had suddenly found herself fidgeting, her stomach doing weird little flips as she saved his number into her phone. "What should I list you as?" she'd asked, thumb hovering over the contact name field. "Daniel Carter, potential client." "Hi, just Daniel," he'd replied, watching her with an intensity that made her fingers tremble slightly on the keyboard. "Unless you'd prefer something more descriptive. Devastatingly handsome football expert would work too." She'd laughed despite herself. "I think your ego is robust enough without encouragement from my contacts list." "Fair point," he'd conceded with a grin, "though I prefer to think of it as accurate self-assessment rather than ego." "Is that what you call it?" she'd teased, finally typing simply Daniel into the field. "There, saved. Though I should warn you, I rarely answer unknown numbers. So you'd better text me first." "Planning on it?" he promised, his eyes never leaving hers as she handed his phone back to him, their fingers brushing in a contact that sent an absurd shiver up her arm. Of course, the moment that was done, they were right back into it, flirting, teasing, laughing. The brief moment of shyness had passed, replaced by the same effortless banter that had characterized their entire interaction. "So Saturday," he'd confirmed as they'd finally made their way to the door. "I'll bring the bourbon. A small batch Kentucky selection that might just convert you from your misguided whiskey preferences." "Bold claim," Kristin had countered, leaning against the doorframe in a pose that felt naturally graceful. I'm not easily persuaded once I've made up my mind. A challenge I'm more than happy to accept, Daniel had replied, his voice dropping to that lower register that seemed specifically designed to make her pulse race. I can be very persuasive when motivated. The way he'd said persuasive, letting the word roll off his tongue with deliberate slowness, had sent another of those ridiculous shivers down her spine. We'll see, she'd managed to reply, hoping her voice sounded more composed than she felt. Though I should warn you, I'm equally stubborn about my team's chances this season. Another debate I look forward to, he'd said, reaching for the door handle but making no immediate move to leave. Though that one might be settled on the field before we can resolve it. I wouldn't count on it. Ow, Kristin had replied, with a confidence that surprised even her. My quarterback has 3 more favorable matchups coming up. Your defense, on the other hand, is facing the league's top offense next week. Daniel had laughed, genuine amusement lighting up his features. You really do know your stats. I'm impressed, Ms. Thompson. Kristin, she'd corrected automatically. If we're going to argue about football and whiskey in my living room, I think we're past professional titles. Kristin, he'd repeated, her name sounding somehow different in his mouth. Richer, more meaningful. Until Saturday then. And when he had finally left, turning back to give her one last smirk and parting comment, she had just stood there, staring after him like a complete idiot. Don't forget to wear your team colors, he'd called over his shoulder as he strode toward the elevator. I want to know exactly which fantasy roster I'm demolishing next season. The doors had closed on his smiling face, leaving Kristin frozen in her doorway, heart racing, cheeks flushed, and mind completely, utterly scrambled. Jason had appeared at her elbow almost immediately, as if he'd been lurking around the corner waiting for Daniel to leave. Well, he'd said, his voice dripping with barely suppressed glee. That was the longest initial consultation in Thompson design history. Should I block off the entire day for all future meetings with quantum innovations? Or just the week? Kristin had glared at him, trying to summon appropriate professional indignation and failing miserably. Don't you have work to do? Nothing as interesting as whatever just happened in that conference room, Jason had replied, falling into step beside her as she'd headed back to her office. Though I must say, your taste has improved dramatically since that boring architect from the Westfield project who kept trying to ask you out. I have no idea what you're talking about. Kristin had lied, knowing full well her blush betrayed her completely. Of course not, Jason had agreed with mock seriousness. You and Mr. Carter were discussing strictly professional matters for 3 hours. The electric tension I could feel from across the room was purely about design concepts, Jason. Kristin had warned, unable to keep the smile from tugging at her lips despite her best efforts. Fine, fine, he'd conceded, raising his hands in surrender. I'll stop. But for what it's worth, he couldn't take his eyes off you. And that, boss, is what we in the business call a very promising sign. Now, hours later, as she sat at her desk replaying every moment of the interaction, Kristin couldn't get that shy moment out of her head. Something about seeing that brief crack in Daniel's confident facade had been more affecting than all the smooth lines and deliberate flirtation. For just a second, he hadn't been the polished businessman or the practiced charmer. He'd been a man who was genuinely interested, maybe even a little nervous about being rejected. And that was the moment that had truly gotten under her skin. Her phone buzzed again. Another message appearing on the screen, just to be clear. Saturday is definitely a date, with football as a bonus feature. In case there was any confusion. DC. Kristin stared at the message, that now familiar flutter returning to her stomach. The directness was both alarming and refreshing. No games, no pretending this was just about business or sports. After a moment's hesitation, she typed back, crystal clear. I'll make extra wings. KT? She set the phone down, a smile spreading across her face despite herself. Whatever insanity had brought her to this point. Magical gender transformation. A supernatural luck, her grandmother's meddling. At least it had led to something interesting. And Daniel Carter was definitely interesting. Kristin exhaled, shaking her head with a soft, amused smile as she leaned back in her chair. The premium leather creaked slightly beneath her, conforming perfectly to her body in a way that even now felt unfamiliar. Curves, where there had once been none. A different distribution of weight. A new center of gravity. She had spent the last day freaking out. And for good reason. Her entire existence had changed overnight. 1 minute she had been Kyle Thompson, fantasy football enthusiast, mediocre account manager, perpetually single guy whose apartment featured more empty pizza boxes than actual furniture. The next, she was Kristin Thompson, successful design firm owner, fashionable redhead, and apparently catnip to tech billionaires with devastating smiles. Talk about an extreme makeover, she muttered to herself, spinning her chair to face the expansive city view. Grandma didn't just change my luck. She changed my entire damn life. Everything was different. Her body, obviously. Still, a foreign country. She was reluctantly touring without a map or phrasebook. Her career, transformed from mind-numbing spreadsheets to creative design empire. Her social standing, from struggling bachelor to successful businesswoman with an apparently active dating life. If Jason's not-so-subtle comments were any indication, even the way people looked at her was different. As Kyle, he'd been essentially invisible. Just another unremarkable guy in khakis passing through the world. As Kristin, she commanded attention simply by existing. She'd noticed it throughout the day. The subtle deference from staff. The approving glances from strangers in the elevator. The way Daniel Carter's eyes had tracked her every movement. I need a drink, she decided, glancing at the elegant bar cart tucked discreetly in the corner of her office. Another perk of being Kristin. Apparently, day drinking was acceptable when it came from crystal decanters instead of beer cans. She rose from her chair, the motion still requiring conscious thought rather than muscle memory, and made her way to the bar. The selection was impressive. Premium spirits arranged with the same aesthetic consideration that Kristin apparently brought to everything in her life. What would Kristin drink? She wondered aloud, fingers hovering over the options. Probably not the Jack Daniels that Kyle would grab. Her hand settled on an amber bottle of bourbon. The expensive kind Kyle would have saved for special occasions. If he could have afforded it at all. She poured a finger into a heavy crystal tumbler. The rich aroma rising to greet her. To new beginnings, she toasted sardonically, raising the glass to her reflection in the window. And to whatever the hell comes next. The bourbon was smooth on her tongue, warming her throat as it went down. Another difference. Kyle would have felt the burn more intensely. Kristin's palate seemed more refined, able to detect subtle notes that would have been lost on him. She returned to her desk, drink in hand, and allowed herself a moment to truly process everything that had happened that day. The meeting that had turned into something else entirely. The client who had suddenly become a potential date. The way she had somehow navigated it all with a confidence and poise that Kyle had never possessed. Jason had popped his head in earlier, after Daniel had left. His expression, a masterclass in suppressed curiosity. So, he'd begun casually, leaning against her doorframe. That went well. The meeting. Kristin had replied with feigned innocence. Yes, I think we covered all the necessary points. Jason had snorted, not buying the act for a second. Please, you two covered about 15 minutes of actual business and 2 hours of whatever that was. I have no idea what you're talking about, Kristin had maintained, shuffling papers on her desk with exaggerated focus. Jason had hummed skeptically. That's why he kept looking at you like you were the last bourbon in the bar during Prohibition. He was being attentive, Kristin had defended weakly. He's a good listener. Oh, he was attentive, all right. Jason had agreed with a knowing smirk. Attentive to every hair flip, every laugh, every time you crossed those legs of yours. Jason, Kristin had exclaimed, feeling the now familiar heat rising to her cheeks. What? He'd asked with mock innocence. I'm just making observations. Professional observations. About our potential client who, by the way, requested your personal cell number from me before the meeting even started. That had given her pause. What? Oh yes, Jason had confirmed with evident delight. Called this morning. Very professionally asking for your direct line in case he had any urgent questions before the meeting. I gave it to him. Of course, Kristin had echoed faintly. Standard protocol, Jason had continued, eyes twinkling. Though most clients don't then spend 3 hours in our conference room, discussing football strategies and bourbon preferences. We talked about the project too. Kristin had protested weakly. Yeah. For approximately 12 minutes. By my count, Jason had replied. Not that I'm complaining. The quantum innovations account would be huge for us. And if the CEO happens to be personally invested in working with our fearless leader, he'd let the implication hang in the air. It's not like that. Kristin had tried, knowing even as she said it that it was exactly like that. Sure it isn't, Jason had agreed, not believing it for a second. Which is why you invited him to your apartment on Saturday. Kristin had choked on air. How did you? These walls aren't soundproof. Jason had explained with a grin. And you two weren't exactly whispering by the end. Kristin had buried her face in her hands. Mortification, warring with an inexplicable giddiness. This is so unprofessional. On the contrary, Jason had countered, pushing away from the doorframe. Cultivating personal relationships with high-value clients is extremely professional. The fact that this particular client happens to be gorgeous, single and clearly smitten with you is just a lucky bonus. Lucky. There was that word again. Her grandmother's promise of luck infusing every aspect of her new life. Just doing my job, Kristin had muttered, not meeting his knowing gaze. Well, keep up the good work, Jason had replied with a wink before finally taking mercy on her and changing the subject. The team needs your input on the Westfield finishing touches. By the way, when you've recovered from your business meeting now, alone with her bourbon and her thoughts, Kristin couldn't help but laugh softly at the absurdity of it all. 24 hours ago, she had been Kyle Thompson, climbing into bed after another forgettable day, wishing for better luck. Now she was Kristin Thompson, sipping expensive bourbon in a corner office, preparing for a date with a man who made her pulse race with just a look. But as she sat there, reflecting on what had just happened, she had one final thought before she shelved it all away and started packing up for the day. Maybe, just maybe, this whole becoming a woman thing might not be the worst thing in the world. In fact, as she picked up her phone to see another message from Daniel, this one a suggestion about the bourbon he planned to bring on Saturday, she found herself smiling again. Maybe Grandma knew what she was doing after all, she murmured, taking another sip of her drink, though I'm never admitting that to her face. The thought of her grandmother's smug satisfaction was almost as terrifying as the realization that she, formerly Kyle Thompson, was actually looking forward to her date with Daniel Carter. Life, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. And for the first time since waking up in this new body, Kristin was almost ready to laugh along with it.